At 009:03, the federal courtroom in Washington, D.C., fell into a silence so still it could have been mistaken for reverence. Rows of uniforms, dark suits, and security details lined the chamber. Each pair of eyes focused on the witness stand where Lieutenant Colonel Grace Keller sat. She looked small beneath the high ceiling and floodlights, not because she lacked stature, but because she wore no arrogance, no bravado. Her uniform was regulation pressed, her ribbons modest, and her posture perfect. Congressman Strickland called the session to order with the kind of grave tone reserved for combat casualty notifications. Donovan rose from the council table, his movements deliberate, his folder thick. He had a reputation in the room ruthless, brilliant, and unrelenting. This morning, he was gunning for Grace. "Lieutenant Colonel Keller," he began, letting her rank drip with skepticism. "You're here to provide testimony related to the 2020 Surov operation. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." Her tone was neutral, void of tension, as if she'd answered this exact question before in far worse settings. Donovan circled her slowly, holding a document up as if it might catch fire. "According to this, your service record has no documented deployment to that region, no chain of command entry, no after-action report. In fact, there's a 16-month blackout in your file, starting January 2020. Can you explain that?" Her eyes remained forward. "I cannot comment on classified assignments." Donovan laughed, dry and sharp. "That's convenient. Isn't it a gap so clean it's like someone scrubbed it? We're supposed to believe you were deployed somewhere, doing something, under some authority, and we just have to take your word for it." She didn't blink. "I was deployed under orders sanctioned through proper channels." Channels. Which ones? He turned to the committee. "Because DOD, CENTCOM, and the Joint Staff have no record of her movements. What she's saying, ladies and gentlemen, is that she disappeared under paperwork no one can see." A few heads in the audience nodded slowly, unsure if they were witnessing fraud or something worse. Donovan pressed closer. "Tell me, Colonel, did you even carry a rifle in that time? Did you work with a team who was your CO?" Grace's face didn't change. "Sir, I am not authorized to answer specifics. So, nothing verifiable, not even a photograph." He leaned in just slightly. "This nation deserves more than shadows when we're risking lives and money." Behind Donovan, a retired major general shifted in his seat. Grace didn't turn her head, but she felt it, felt his eyes narrowing. Donovan snapped a second document on the desk in front of her. "Here's an affidavit from Colonel Winchell, head of Surov Deployment Logistics. He states no personnel entered or exited the region without his authorization. He's never heard of you." The sound of paper brushing wood echoed louder than expected. The room wasn't breathing. "Then maybe Colonel Winchell wasn't looped into every compartment," she said. Donovan smiled. "So now we're dealing in compartments." "Great. Which one? Who's show us?" She didn't. Her silence was carved from stone. Donovan threw up his hands. "I can't keep wasting this committee's time with ghosts and hypotheticals. Either you were there, or you weren't. If you were, you're hiding something. And if you weren't, this whole thing is a fabrication." Strickland cleared his throat. "Counselor, the witness's clearance has been vetted." "With respect, Chairman, vetting isn't proof, it's a nod in the dark." Donovan turned to the audience. "This officer claims to have performed something no one saw, under no chain of command, with zero documentation. We're expected to build oversight decisions around that." Grace's hands were still clasped in her lap, unmoving, but the corners of her mouth were pulled tight now. The strain was starting to show not from fear, but from being forced to absorb a blow without responding. Donovan's voice rose, no longer pretending to question. "If you can't verify your service, then what are you even doing here? Colonel, tell us. Tell this nation what you did for 16 months that no one is allowed to know." She looked at him then, one clean, steady gaze. Donovan took it as permission. He stepped closer. "Prove it. Right now. Prove you ever wore the uniform beyond this costume." A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere behind her. Not from her. She hadn't moved. The chairman reached for his gavel, but the tension was already out of control. Donovan lowered his voice. Or is this uniform the only piece of evidence you've got? It happened in a blink. As she shifted to slide a folder back across the stand, the thick wood of the bench caught the edge of her uniform sleeve. The fabric gave with a sound that shouldn't have been audible, but in that silence, it cut through everything. A rip, not loud, but enough. A narrow tear opened along her shoulder seam. From that gap, a sliver of skin appeared, and on it, something darker. Not a flag, not a name, a mark. Something geometric. A quiet gasp broke through the rows of seats. General Radford stood, slow but deliberate. The judge paused mid-gavel. His mouth went dry. The room didn't quite know what it was seeing, but it knew enough. Grace remained still, her eyes back forward, her discipline holding. Donovan hadn't noticed yet, but everyone else had, and everything had just changed. On paper, Lieutenant Colonel Grace Keller looked ordinary. Her official record showed 2 decades of service, most of it spent at Joint Base Meyer-Henderson Hall or Fort Huachuca, split between intelligence analysis and administrative oversight. There were deployments early on Kandahar, Baghdad, but they were brief, routine, and ended with nothing beyond standard service notes. A Bronze Star here, a Joint Service Commendation there, but no Valor Awards, no combat distinctions, nothing that screamed attention. She had qualified in the T-6 Texan II during her 5th year, part of a cohort bound for ISR flight rotation, but she was reassigned before she ever touched an operational cockpit. The transition was noted only as mission reassignment. From there, her file listed back-to-back staff positions and a short stint coordinating logistics for the Defense Attaché Office. There were gaps, too. 2 stretches. One 16 months and another just under a year marked only by classified activity codes. Not unusual in theory, but the durations raised quiet eyebrows in rooms where people knew what to look for. She lived in Alexandria, alone. No spouse, no pets, no close ties in the area. Her apartment lease was always month to month, the kind of life that left little behind and took up even less space. A few fellow officers described her as quiet, sharply efficient, and disarmingly polite. Most didn't know much else. She didn't linger in group chats. She never raised her voice in staff meetings. But there were rumors. At least one colonel claimed that a 3-star general at Fort Belvoir once stood when she entered a private briefing, not out of courtesy, out of respect. Another whispered she had override clearance on a drone tasking protocol during a joint task force simulation. Her name never appeared in the AAR, but something about the outcome changed the tone of the review. She never wore unauthorized patches. Her boots were always regulation, but she walked with the kind of silence that made security personnel shift when she passed. Some said she was a human contradiction barely known, but instantly remembered, like the echo of something sharp you almost heard. Every year, she declined consideration for the War College. When asked why, she just said she wasn't done with field service. And yet, she never held a field command. No direct reports. No full unit oversight. No standard operational pipeline. Just quiet assignments that ended with closed doors and few notes. Her CAC access was current. Her SCI clearance was active. But some records had redacted fields, even from top-tier oversight. A few junior officers joked she must have been a desk analyst who liked mystery. One retired general didn't laugh. He just said she had better muscle memory than any intel officer he'd ever seen. None of it proved anything. But it made people wonder. Not loudly, not in official circles, just in passing. The kind of curiosity that whispered, not shouted, because those who knew how to spot silence could tell when it was intentional. And with Grace Keller, it always was. Donovan waited until the room had settled into that particular kind of quiet, the kind that follows a command, not a suggestion. It was 10:12 when he stepped to the center of the floor with a file marked unclassified. though every page inside had once been locked behind digital walls. He carried it, like a weapon. The panel of representatives leaned in slightly. Lieutenant Colonel Grace Keller hadn't moved. "Let's talk about the 2020 deployment cycle. Shall we?" Donovan's voice had the sharp edge of someone who liked hearing himself carve someone else open. "You're listed as attached to CENTCOM in an advisory role, but there are no TDY logs, no transit manifests, no command chains that include your name." He paused. "Can you explain that?" "I cannot comment on the nature of assignments under classification." Her reply was smooth, almost rehearsed. Not defensive, not hostile, just flat. "Of course." He flipped a page. That phrase again. Convenient little parachute. "Isn't it classified?" He paced slowly. "But here's the problem. I have here a signed statement from Colonel Shepard, lead operations officer for CENTCOM's forward command at the time. He says he never once saw you in Qatar, Kuwait, or forward deployed with any advising unit." Her hands were still, resting just inside the fold of her jacket sleeves. She did not look at him. "I was not attached to his unit, sir." "So, you were where?" "Exactly." He closed the file and stared. "Let me guess. You can't confirm or deny, just like you can't confirm or deny where you were during your 16-month gap, just like you can't explain the reassignments, the lack of performance reviews, or the absence of any OER above battalion level." "Sir, all my records have been reviewed and verified by the appropriate oversight channels." Her voice never rose. It didn't have to. Donovan narrowed his eyes. "Verified by who?" "Because we asked DIA. We asked JSOC. We asked everyone who should have known. And what we got were black boxes and red lines. You're either the best-kept secret in the armed forces, or you're a myth someone forgot to fact-check." Across the room, General Radford sat motionless, but his fingers had curled once against the armrest of his chair. Grace noticed. She did not acknowledge. Donovan turned to the committee. "She claims to be part of Operation Saltline, then Operation Iron Gate. Neither show up in any congressional report or after-action brief. The operations, if they existed, are ghost files. Tell me, Colonel, how many times can you erase a trail before it looks like a lie?" Chairman Strickland cleared his throat, but Donovan raised a finger without turning. "I'm not accusing. I'm asking. Is there any verifiable deployment during those gaps that this committee can review?" "No, sir." Her reply came without hesitation. "Then we are left with faith, and paper-thin faith. At that." He walked a slow circle. "How do we justify decisions that hinge on your testimony when you cannot even prove you were present at the events in question? My record is incomplete by necessity, not deceit." Her words landed softer than expected. Not an excuse, an acknowledgement. Donovan stopped pacing. "What exactly qualifies you to advise on high-level threat assessments if no one can track your service through actual command records?" She didn't flinch. "I am qualified through performance, not publicity." Donovan smiled without warmth. How convenient that the only proof of that performance is inaccessible to everyone in this room. He stepped in close, just enough to shift the tension again. "Tell me, did you even carry a weapon? Or were you too far in the shadows to get your boots dirty?" General Radford exhaled once through his nose, but said nothing. Grace's jaw tensed, barely visible. "I have always followed lawful orders and completed every mission assigned." Donovan leaned back. "Sounds like a story. And stories, Colonel, are lovely. But this committee doesn't run on fables. It runs on evidence." Her silence then was louder than any outburst might have been. Donovan's next step forward seemed intended to provoke. "This room, this country, cannot afford to build policies on ghosts and legends. Either tell us what you did, or stop wasting our time." She looked at him for the first time, eyes steady. She didn't blink. And for a second, something in Donovan paused. But just for a second. At 10:16, the air inside the hearing room was brittle. Donovan's voice filled every inch of space, sharp and insistent. but it no longer held complete control. Grace Keller hadn't responded in several minutes. She sat like a statue, still and unreadable, as if the questioning had stopped mattering. In front of her, a pile of documents sat slightly off-center on the polished oak of the witness stand. Donovan stepped back with mock frustration, arms half raised. That's all you've got. A name, a uniform, and a wall of silence. The chairman shifted in his seat but said nothing. Neither did General Radford. His posture hadn't changed in 20 minutes, but his eyes were locked on Grace, not the attorney. Donovan turned to grab a supplemental file. In that instant, a loose page near the microphone began to slide. Grace's hand moved to stop it. Not urgent, not panicked, just instinct. A flat-palmed motion, precise, almost too fast for the eye to catch. Her shoulder brushed the rough corner of the stand. A quiet tear followed, soft and abrupt. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness, it sounded like paper tearing underwater. A dozen heads turned toward her. She didn't look down, didn't touch the spot, but everyone saw it. A seam had pulled open just behind her right shoulder. At first, it revealed nothing, just fabric, then skin, then something darker, a sliver of black ink, straight-edged and sharp like carbon fiber etched into muscle, geometric, angled, controlled. One breath later, General Radford stood. No announcement, no motion from the chair, just the slow, sure rise of someone who'd seen too much to ignore what he was looking at. Across the room, two security officers shifted subtly. One adjusted his stance. The other's hand hovered near his jacket flap. No weapons drawn. Just a shift in readiness that comes from training, not fear. Chairman Strickland turned his head slowly, his eyes going wide before narrowing again. He didn't speak yet. He didn't need to. The tattoo wasn't military issue. It wasn't a flag or a unit insignia. It was composed of 6 interlocking triangles in a nested pattern, broken by 3 parallel lines. The placement was intentional, over the scapula, right where a plate carrier wouldn't obscure it, but a uniform would. Donovan didn't notice. He kept talking. This is the problem with hearings like this. We bring in someone who has the right titles, the right grooming, and a whole lot of attitude. And we're expected to. He paused. A sound behind him caught his ear. Not a word. Just a scraping of a chair leg from one of the aides as they stood. Too quickly. He turned. Grace hadn't moved. But everyone else had. Strickland brought down his gavel. One sharp strike. Not for order, but for time. This session is in recess for 15 minutes. All non-essential personnel will clear the chamber immediately. Donovan blinked. Mr. Chairman. Now. Strickland's voice had gone flat. Not angry, not flustered, just final. Staffers began collecting documents. Security moved fast but without panic. Junior officers in the gallery exchanged confused glances. They didn't know what they'd seen. Not really. But they knew the room had flipped. Grace remained seated. Her hands rested as they had before. Her posture unchanged. But something about her presence had shifted. The stillness now felt like potential, not passivity. Radford didn't look at her. He didn't have to. He had already seen enough. And for the first time all morning, Donovan was silent. He stood in place as the people around him moved, speaking in clipped tones, avoiding his eyes. He followed no one's gaze. He never saw the ink, not really. But the ones who did would remember it. And they would not forget what it meant. By 10:31, the hearing room was empty except for 5 people. The echo of movement still hung in the air, but no one spoke. Grace Keller sat exactly as she had before, her back straight, hands folded, the tear in her uniform untouched. A faint strip of skin still showed at the shoulder, the ink beneath it no longer hidden. General Radford stood 2 paces from the witness stand, his arms behind his back. He didn't look at the chairman. He looked at Grace. And when he spoke, it was barely above a whisper. Phantom section. The chairman didn't respond at first. He glanced at Grace, then back to Radford. That's not real. That was disbanded. Canceled before it started. No. Radford's voice was calm. It never showed up on paper, but it never stopped. Strickland sat heavily, as if the chair had caught him by surprise. His fingers moved to his tie, adjusting it out of habit. Not comfort. He looked at the mark again, almost afraid to stare, but unable to look away. How long? 11 years. Grace answered before Radford could. Her voice held the same controlled cadence, but now there was something beneath it. Not emotion, just weight. The tattoo? What is it? Biometric ink. Grace spoke plainly. The geometric pattern encodes mission protocols, handler assignments, and operational clearances, only readable through optical signature tracing, keyed to security level recognition. Strickland swallowed. So if someone without that clearance sees it, they see what I just saw. An ink design, nothing more. But if someone like Radford sees it, he knows exactly what it means. Radford nodded once. There are 12 marks still active. Hers is one of them. Mine isn't. The chairman leaned forward. We brought her in here to testify under subpoena. She was going to be discredited in public. If that fabric hadn't torn, you would have buried the only witness who couldn't be compromised. Radford said it without judgment. Just the truth. Strickland looked down, then tapped the gavel handle gently against the desk without striking. He turned toward the exit, then spoke over his shoulder. I want civilian counsel dismissed. JAG will take over immediately. Anyone without clearance level 7 or higher is out. No press, no transcripts beyond this point. A security officer stepped out without being told. Another remained by the door. Radford took a step closer to Grace, but not too close. His voice was lower now. When were you activated? June 2012. Your intake. Not on record? Radford gave the faintest nod, the kind that didn't ask for more. He looked to Strickland. She shouldn't have been pulled into this hearing at all. Phantom assets aren't supposed to be named, subpoenaed, or even acknowledged. That tattoo was the last fail-safe, passive confirmation in case everything else collapsed. And now it's been exposed. Strickland shook his head. The fallout. Handled quickly. Nothing lasting. Grace said it before Radford could. Anyone who saw the mark will begin to question what they saw. It doesn't match anything in their database. The longer it lingers, the less it seems real. Radford finally sat down. His voice dropped again. She shouldn't be testifying at all. Strickland looked up, but she is. And now, everyone in the room understood exactly why. It was 0219 local when Grace's team crossed into the outer perimeter. The air tasted of dust and dry vegetation under a starless sky. No moon. Cloud cover was low and thick, rendering thermal imaging useless against the heat masking from a nearby generator array. Surov Compound sat in a shallow basin just north of the ridgeline, a dark smudge in the deeper darkness, encircled by 2 layers of fencing and a staggered patrol route that rotated every 12 minutes. The hostages were confirmed inside a concrete structure with no windows, buried 1 level underground, guarded by a rotating element of 12 insurgents armed with AK variants and 1 RPG-7 at the rear tower. They entered through the maintenance culvert on the eastern slope, a low crawl for 40 meters through ankle-deep standing water and rusted metal piping. The stench of decay and oil filled their nostrils. Night vision goggles stayed on passive mode, amplifying the scarce ambient light into a world of green and black. They moved silently, each footfall placed with practiced care. Comms were cut, no RF emissions allowed, only hand signals and Morse pulses via thigh-mounted IR strobes, invisible to the naked eye. Grace was point. The other 3 followed in a tight wedge formation, their suppressed SIG P229s held in a low ready position, an extension of their will. The pistols were selected for their reliability in close quarters, loaded with subsonic ammo that would make less noise than a cough. At the junction chamber, 2 guards sat smoking, their conversation a low murmur that didn't carry. Grace tapped once on her thigh. Left flank. 1 silent step forward. 2 precise shots. The only sound was the almost imperceptible hiss of the suppressors and the soft thud as 2 bodies met the damp concrete. They breached the south sub-entry using a mechanical override key fabricated from satellite scans of the compound's older generator model. The door opened inward without a sound. No alarm. No squeal of metal. Inside, the corridor bent right, then dipped into a sloped passage with low concrete ceilings and thick overhead wires they had to duck under, careful not to disturb the decades of dust. At 0232 they reached the main hallway. 6 doors, all locked. A thermal scan confirmed 4 warm bodies in the third room. Non-combatants. No movement. The hostages were sedated. This had been expected. Grace signaled the medic forward. 2 vials of atropine were prepared for emergency wake-up. They wouldn't need them. The far end of the corridor held the armory. A single guard was posted inside. No direct line of sight. They used a fiber-optic camera under the threshold, the tiny lens feeding a live view to Grace's wrist-mounted display. She marked his patrol route, a lazy 3-step pattern, then waited for the timing to shift. When it did, she opened the door 5 inches, slid in low, and fired twice. 1 breath, 1 down. At 0238 they entered the holding chamber. 23 hostages, 2 barely conscious, were huddled together. No chains, just plastic zip ties binding their wrists. 1 girl, no older than 20, had a broken arm and had bitten through part of her lip to keep from crying out. Grace made eye contact. The girl's eyes were wide with fear, but she saw the calm authority in Grace's expression and held still. No panic, just confusion. Grace nodded once. The girl nodded back. A silent transfer of trust. They split the group into 3. Grace led the forward stack. The medic stayed mid, ready to assist anyone who faltered. Rear security was tight, watching their back trail. They moved slow, a 2-second interval between each person, guiding the group back through the cold, dark access corridor. 1 hostage, a middle-aged man, began to hyperventilate, the sound dangerously loud. Grace knelt beside him in an instant, looked him straight in the eye. She didn't speak, just tapped her own mouth, then her nose. Mouth closed, nose only. Then she mouthed the words, "You're safe. Follow me." His breathing steadied. At 0249 they reached the culvert again. The water had risen 3 inches, cold and foul, but they moved fast. Grace cleared the rear and stayed last, her weapon sweeping the darkness behind them until every civilian was through. At 0258 they reached the exfiltration zone, a dusty clearing on the far side of the ridge. A Black Hawk, tail number scrubbed, no call sign, was waiting with blades hot, its form a hulking shadow against the graying sky. Dust kicked up, but the rotors stayed low, a thrumming beat that vibrated through the ground. Each hostage was loaded in, their movements clumsy with exhaustion and relief. The rear ramp stayed down until the last man was inside. Grace and her second secured the perimeter, eyes scanning the ridgeline. No shots fired, no radio chatter, no signal ever sent. Just a green light blink from the co-pilot, visible only through their NVGs. At 0303 they lifted. The helicopter held low to the terrain for 20 clicks before veering east into a temporary corridor established by diplomatic staging. No airspace violation, no radar lock. They disappeared before anyone knew to look. No names were exchanged. No voices were raised above a whisper. Grace never even drew her primary weapon. By 0411, the hostages were in medical processing at a secure location. No one ever filed an after-action report. No commendations were issued. No flags were raised. But 23 people went home. That was the job, and it was done. It was 0742 when Grace stepped through the west entrance of the White House. She wore her Class A uniform, the rip at the shoulder meticulously repaired with matching thread, the seam now stronger than the original. Her boots had been brushed that morning, though the sir were already collecting a fine layer of deep-sea dust from the walk across the south lawn. The Secret Service agent who scanned her badge said nothing as he nodded her through, his eyes betraying no recognition, just professional process. The meeting room was one level beneath the West Wing, a secure chamber that was narrow, windowless, and soundproof. The air was chilled and recycled, carrying the faint hum of secure electronics and the scent of industrial cleaner. 2 seats were occupied. The Secretary of Defense stood, with his back to the wall, arms crossed, speaking softly into a closed laptop. General Radford sat at the long table, spine straight, hands folded, the same way he'd sat through 3 tours and every debrief that followed. Grace took the chair opposite, her own posture a mirror of his. At 7:49, the president entered. No announcement, no motorcade shuffle, just a door opening with a soft click and the sound of leather soles on polished tile. She didn't offer her hand. She didn't need to. It was a meeting, not a reception. She took the seat at the head of the table and opened a folder marked only with a single red stripe. The room held quiet like a lid sealing a jar. One of the hostages you recovered at Surov was Elise Hammond, my goddaughter. Grace nodded once. The name had been in the manifest. She remembered the face, blood at the lip, no sound, eyes that held. I won't ask how you found her. The president's voice was calm, a steady tone forged in crisis. But I will ask for something else. The folder was pushed across the table. It contained an initial framework, 5 pages thick, handwritten notes in the margins, most in red ink, diagrams of failover channels, command relay nodes, security architecture for a high-assurance nuclear protocol. She tapped once on the title page. I want a threat assessment team built and led by someone who knows how to see what doesn't show up in reports, someone who operates where the paperwork can't go. The Secretary of Defense cleared his throat. You'll have clearance beyond the National Command Authority. Your authority will be direct, your budget black, need to know only. You won't be listed in any org chart. Grace didn't ask what the fallback authority was. She already knew. It was the person sitting at the head of the table. General Radford stood without a word. He reached into his inside pocket and removed a matte black coin, its surface cool and non-reflective, etched without color. It wasn't metal. It felt like a ceramic composite, heavy and dense. No date, no emblem, just a complex geometry that echoed the mark on her shoulder. He placed it face down on the table and slid it forward with one fingertip. Grace accepted it with a slow nod, her fingers closing around its solid weight. No words were exchanged. The coin was both an access key and a burden. The president closed the folder. You won't be mentioned in the press. There won't be a ceremony. No one outside this room will ever know what you're doing. That's not necessary. I know. By 08:12, the meeting was over. No photos were taken. No documents left the room. Only the coin and the weight of the work ahead.